Hi there, this is Katie Groves, and in this video, I'm going to be attempting to explain the phenomena of dissociative viewing and remote viewing in MKUltra programming and MKUltra slaves. I am a survivor of monarch mind control, the next generation of MKUltra programming, which I still consider part of MKUltra, as there really is no actual dividing line, in my opinion and experience, between what people call Project MKUltra and the so-called Project Monarch that supposedly followed after it, quote-unquote, went underground in 1973 when the CIA claimed it had stopped. It continued just as it had before. There was just a little bit more tightened security, as if there wasn't enough to begin with. So I consider myself a survivor of Monarch MKUltra, as I was born into the projects in 1996. I was trained from infancy to remote view. It started as dissociative viewing, which is what I call the umbrella term for all dissociative controlled experiences. So controlled out-of-body experiences is what I mean to say. And remote viewing is specifically a controlled out-of-body experience in which a person dissociates to a place that is far away. So they're viewing something that's remote. But dissociative viewing doesn't need to be from so far away. It can include controlled out-of-body experience in which the person is simply able to project their consciousness around a room. If they're able to look from behind them, above them, if they're able to project their consciousness out of the door. As soon as a person is able to project their consciousness to a place that they could not simply physically turn around or look a different direction and see with their body, then I consider that to be the beginning of remote viewing. But real remote viewing, in my opinion, is when a person is actually viewing, say, across a town or across the world. In this video, I want to attempt to demystify the phenomena of DV and RV and help people to understand that this is a scientific phenomena that is achievable for MKUltra slaves, that is not exactly psychic or extrasensory. This is not supernatural. This is not endowed by some entity of some kind. From my experience, this is something that is achieved through repetitive conditioning from early childhood in monarch slaves who have high propensity for dissociation to begin with, typically due to having been multi-generationally programmed in previous generations. So their very DNA existed in monarch slaves in their parents, existed in monarch slaves in their grandparents and great-grandparents and so on may not have been government mind-controlled, but they may have been abused in satanic cults, in ritual abuse cults of various kinds that practice dissociative programming. And so there is a genetic line, a genetic history of dissociation going back generations. It's something that scientists have found is hereditary. It's the propensity to dissociate. That's part of why monarch mind control is called monarch, is because scientists supposedly first discovered the phenomenon of genetic memory in monarch butterflies. That monarch butterflies, in their migration patterns, they will die partway through migrating from one area to another, and their offspring will continue the migration to the desired location. So they were never verbally told, as far as we know, where to go. They genetically have that knowledge in them from birth. And so that's why we call it monarch, is because, like monarch butterflies, dissociative slaves receive the propensity to dissociate from their parents through genetic memory. At least the best high-level dissociative slaves do. And so it is these slaves with this family history that tend to be best candidates for dissociative viewing and all sorts of extreme dissociative phenomena. So for me, being a survivor of multi-generational ritualistic abuse, dissociative programming, with parents born into the MKUltra projects, I was a good candidate for this. I am what people call a bloodliner. I come from that type of family, from the satanic elite, so I was a good candidate. I want to explain the mechanics of how my programming worked in infancy on, and how I was trained to program others to do this. I am still very shaky in my healing process around having been forced to program. And it's very difficult for me to talk about the things I was made to do. So I'm going to speak generally about what I've observed, methods I've observed used, some of which were used on me, some of which I was forced to use on others, and some of which I've witnessed. And I'm not going to be too specific about the traumas, the actual traumas for me, in which I experienced or observed these things. I'm just going to speak generally from what I know. So I hope that made sense. I'm just telling you the vantage point from which I will be speaking because I still have a lot of trauma. So we're going to first talk about out-of-body experience and dissociative identity disorder. As anyone who's familiar with Monarch MKUltra probably knows, it relies on dissociative identity disorder, on the forcible creation of dissociative parts to form a system of parts that then work together in the person's mind to regulate their emotions, allow them to survive extreme trauma, and allow them or force them to dissociate from and not remember certain traumas. This enables the person to be a very good slave. And a person with naturally occurring DID, as well as forcibly created DID, will often have out-of-body experiences. They will often feel disconnected from their body from early childhood, from when it develops. And they may have memories of watching themselves, memories of floating above their body, outside of their body, memories of floating out of their body and then disappearing into some kind of fantasy world. Or perhaps a person has memories during a trauma that they may or may not be aware of leaving their body and fixating on an object outside of their body that is calming to them or is neutral. So to give an example, this will be a little graphic, but I'm going to try to make it as tempered as possible. A child is being sexually assaulted, perhaps even an adult, but we're going to use the example of a child because we're talking about childhood trauma. Sorry about that. A child is being raped, and they see a fly on the wall, and the fly is buzzing. The fly is a good distraction, so they fixate really, really hard on the fly. They're being assaulted from behind. They don't have to look at their abuser. They just look at the fly. And they may hyper-focus their vision on it naturally. No one is priming them or prepping them to do this. They just naturally hyper-focus on that fly. And they may leave their body and just watch it. They may zoom in, and they're not aware of what they could normally see in their vision around them. Normally they would have a larger visual scope, but because they've left their body to look at the fly, they may see it, within a very short, there's a very short radius around the fly that, constitutes their vision. This is something that has been documented, at least in MKUltra research that I've seen, files that those people had. I've seen them do documentation on people who were not dissociatively programmed, but children who naturally had DID due to abuse, say familial abuse at home. Non-systematic, just constant abuse. This happens to children naturally. They will leave their bodies, fixate on something, and be unaware of anything else during a trauma. So taking this naturally occurring phenomenon and attempting to control it is the task of a programmer attempting to induce dissociative viewing in a slave. The purpose is to take somebody who would already do something like this psychologically, who would already naturally go towards that dissociative coping, and prime them to do it in the way you want them to, as their programmer. So this can be started in infancy, which is a horrible thing to think about, of course. But I'm attempting to explain this, so forgive me if this sounds callous. I'm dissociating from my own emotions just in order to talk about it. An infant who's being primed for dissociative viewing will be repetitively primed, in my experience. Different groups do different things, but this is what the government mind control group did to me and to others around me. The infant will be repetitively primed with an object called a safe object. For me as an infant, this object was a stuffed animal, a little pink octopus. It was very cute and small. They will be repetitively conditioned to associate the object with safety, while being repetitively conditioned to associate a flip side object, a reversal object, with danger. For me, the reversal object was a stuffed spider. The stuffed spider and the stuffed octopus were like mirror images of each other. I think they may have actually been made for programming. The spider was black, the octopus light pink. It was part of a light-dark duality program. Duality programming is a common basis for monarch programming, and I could write several books about that. The danger object, the spider, was conditioned into me by terrorizing your own spiders. A reason that spiders were chosen was because human beings naturally fear certain things. These are genetic, biological, instinctual fears. Things like spiders, snakes, and bodily fluids. It's well documented that these are things used in trauma-based mind control programming. The idea is that before the psyche really forms in a tiny child, they will instinctually be afraid of things that the programmers need not train them to be frightened by. They will just already be there. They will already be squeamish and afraid. And so this is perfect for programming. The programmers can already tell what's going to scare a child without even knowing them. They're human. And so they use these primal fears of creepy, crawly things and human bodily fluids to terrorize children, and then repetitively condition them to be even more afraid of them than they normally would be through trauma, so that they become even more controllable using the stimuli. So for me, it was spiders, and they used this stuffed stuffed as a symbolic object after repetitively terrorizing me around actual live spiders. The stuffed spider was clearly spider-like enough that I could identify it in my mind as a living spider. I couldn't tell the difference because I was so small. I was a baby. And so the spider was flashed in front of me repeatedly to terrorize me, while the octopus was flashed repeatedly in rapid succession back and forth between the two in the periphery of my vision. The octopus would start out being flashed in front of me next to the spider, and then it would be repetitively moved back and forth over and over, further and further into the periphery of my vision, until I found myself naturally, desperately seeking to focus on the octopus and ignore the spider. But I didn't have a lot of control over what I saw, over what I did. I was a baby. And I found myself naturally dissociating towards the octopus. The goal of this programming was to get me to leave my body and to focus on the octopus and ignore the spider. Much like the child who would naturally focus on the fly on the wall, I was being primed to focus on the octopus in an artificially induced setting by programmers who were systematically manipulating this tendency in me to dissociate. for their own purposes. Eventually, the octopus was placed behind me, and worse traumas were induced. I was no longer just being terrorized with the spider. The spider was consistently there, but sexual abuse, torture was induced on top of it physically to get me to leave my body and to look behind me to see the octopus. Like I said, they used my periphery so that I would see the motion, so that I would understand that it was being moved behind me. If they just placed it behind me and I didn't know it was there, this would be no good. This would be pointless. So they kept repetitively doing this until it would be behind me, and then once I was able to successfully see it behind me, and they had tests for determining that I had done this successfully, because obviously I couldn't talk and tell them that I had, they then started moving it further, putting it on the ceiling, putting me face down, having me view it from outside of my body of the ceiling while I was being assaulted, and so on and so forth. Eventually, and this I don't believe was achieved when I was an infant, but as I was an older child, I was able to see the octopus and similar objects from further programming outside of the room and eventually down the hall, and it just kept going over and over again. Worse and worse tortures, forcing me further out of my body with priming and programming beforehand to help lead me and suggest me towards where the objects would be. And eventually I was able to locate objects without being told where they would be, and to locate people, and it just escalated from there. I'm not going to go into details about all those various programs and how they achieved that in this video. If people are interested, I can talk about it further, but I wanted to give an example of a blueprint program from infancy that can help people to understand how this stuff is created. I shared in a video that I'll link in the description below about my first memory from infancy. That was what I identified as my first memory. I have other early memories, like the one I just described, that I can't pinpoint the timeline as to which was before or after. I have reason to believe that the one that I describe in the video I call my first memory may really be my first earliest memory, but I also, by saying first, meant that it was the first thing, most important early childhood memory that I recalled when I started deprogramming. It was something that I had always retained memory of, but not completely, and I since recalled more fragments of it that have helped me to understand it and put it into more context. In the memory, to summarize, I witnessed a trauma directly in front of me as staged by my mother and father. My father was the aggressor, my mother was being victimized. Both my parents were in on my programming. I don't know to what degree my mother chose that particular situation, to what degree my father, but they were there. There was a trauma. I was on the landing of a staircase, watching them through a door frame, and as soon as my father advanced on my mother and was about to strike her or rape her or something, I don't know what, as soon as something very bad was about to happen, I left my body. I fragmented in a series all around myself. So I have a series of snapshot memories of being outside my body from different vantage points, and then a final memory of being directly above my body looking behind me. Directly behind me was a giant window, outside of which was a tree, and in the center of which was a indentation from what my mother told me was a BB gun shot from a neighbor boy. She told me that later. And when I lifted out of my body and traveled around in rapid succession, fragmenting, splitting, seeing things from different vantage points, I settled in the vantage point behind me of the window with the tree. I hyper-zoomed in on the image of the tree and the BB gun indentation, and all I could see was that. And I was dissociated, and in that memory, I have emotional imprint, an emotional imprint of dissociation, of emptiness, of betrayal, of loss, of things I can't really explain because I was so tiny, but those are words I put on it now to describe what I felt. Before I recovered certain snapshots, the snapshots in between the first and last images in that, I had the image of my parents, and then I had simply the image of me behind myself. And growing up, I retained this memory the entire time. I was reprogrammed to believe that I was 2. At the time, it was a quick fix for my programmers to prevent me from understanding that I had eidetic memory as an infant, but now I understand myself to have been younger upon deprogramming that. And what I now understand that memory to be is a memory of an early dissociative viewing success. That was a major success for my programmers. I had successfully fragmented in 360 vision to settle upon an image directly behind me and fixate there with eidetic precision, with photographic-like memory skill. This memory is undeniably real for me. I have no doubts about it at all. Like I said, I never fully lost it. And so this is my absolute proof to myself that my dissociative viewing experiences are real. And since recovering many, many more experiences and experiencing them consciously in deprogramming, I can tell you this stuff is real. I know that if you are a skeptic and a disbeliever, this won't convince you. Nothing I could probably do would convince you. I could show you hardcore, proof, and it wouldn't be enough for some people. But I know that this stuff is real for me. Just last night, I had an experience where I had a minor verbal conflict with my partner, and we've worked it all out now since. It was nothing too severe, but we don't get into conflict much. We had a small conflict, and afterwards my dissociative parts who were extremely frightened of conflict felt very unsafe, even though my conscious adult mind knows that my partner was not going to hurt me and everything was resolved. These child parts of me felt unsafe, so they accessed our still intact ability to dissociatively view that we try not to use much anymore, and forced us to dissociatively view watching over our body and around the room we were sleeping in to make sure that our partner did not hurt us, that nobody else hurt us or punished us for what we consider to be our bad behavior. Basically relapsed into a way of thinking from our trauma and went back on a traumatic dissociative coping that was to post altars around the room and force them to watch at night. My alters want to say that they consented actually to doing this. It was their idea. And as a result of that, I'm extremely exhausted today. It takes quite a toll on my body. But I have memories of, while sleeping, watching over myself. And this is something I've spoken of in a previous video that I titled Preventing Reaccessing Part 3, I believe, Dissociative Viewing to Protect the Self. So now in my recovery, I have rewired some systems, done some reprogramming, not wanting to keep programming intact, but out of necessity. I've been unable to fully deprogram these parts because they just don't feel safe to let go of these abilities completely. I've reprogrammed them to serve certain functions for me, like watching over me when I sleep, when I feel like I'm in an unsafe situation, and so on and so forth. I also have parts that when we're in a large crowd, will strategically view all around me, have panoramic vision. In the programming, it was called omnivision, being able to see in a 360 direction around yourself through dissociative parts. So that's something that's been useful to help parts feel safe. But it's really something that I want to put away and end. I just want to feel safe enough to do so. Because I hate programming. I don't want it in my life. Last thing I'll say is I didn't touch on remote viewing. Like I said, I wasn't going to touch on that really in this video. But I want to say that the applications of remote viewing are extreme, and that most people in my experience in Monarch MK Ultra do not have the ability to remote view extremely far away. They more have propensity for minor dissociative viewing, like in the ways that I've described. But I was capable of remote viewing to an extreme distance. I've not explored those memories enough to be super grounded in them. There's still so much dissociation involved in the way I recall them. And I'm constantly checking and rechecking my memories and asking parts about certain memories that feel extremely dissociative or drugged or hazy to make sure that I'm not really experiencing something that happened in an inner world, that I wasn't tricked through programming, that it wasn't virtual reality, something like that. But I will make a video soon speaking about my experiences with that and how I understand that to have been a thing, and the connections that has to theta programming, with astral projection and tapping into the collective consciousness.